Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. We continue on with the Class of 99 series, and we're going to track back a little bit to what was really the first blockbuster of the summer that year in Stephen Sommers' The Mummy. I think this is the first time in about 2 decades I'd seen it, so it was definitely an interesting rewatch. And to discuss it with me is a filmmaker I've had on the podcast a few times, including earlier this year when we discussed The Matrix. Please welcome back to the show, David Spaltro. Thank you very much for joining me, David.
Hey, man, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So I remember when we first started to talk about doing The Mummy, it was in reference to a tweet I had seen where somebody had said that The Mummy, the Stephen Sommers movie, was better than Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Wow.
And I think I had posted on Facebook, and we'd gone back and forth a little bit about it. And it's like, yeah, we'll go ahead and discuss this movie. First of all, that's not true. Even by the most
I agree.
Even by the most generous scale, I in no way, shape, or form is this film better than Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah.
And my most recent rewatch confirmed that. What was what is your history talk to watching this movie?
I grew up as a kid. I grew up as a really big fan of the original Universal monster movies. So when I heard they were remaking it, I actually remember all the this film has a great.
Mm-hmm.
There were very many directors that were attached to this. George Romero was going to do it in the early '90s. Clive Barker was going to do a real low-budget, dark, more horror version. Yeah, I remember the first time that I saw the trailer and I knew that Brendan Fraser was going to be in it. The first trailer I saw kind of almost turned me off from seeing it because it looked absolutely ridiculous for a movie. It looked like a massive. It looked like they were trying to make a big summer movie that I didn't think gelled with the material, not having seen it, not knowing where they were going. So at first I wasn't even sure I really wanted to see it.
Yeah.
And then I remember being very pleasantly surprised when it was extremely well done and entertaining in a way that, it's funny, the person you're talking about who said it was better than Raiders, my initial impact when I saw it, because they hadn't made another Indiana Jones film, was this feels like an Indiana Jones. I got a lot of the same kind of it's epic, it's archaeology, it's fun. It was fun and funny, and there were some there were some pretty hardcore moments for it being like a Disney kind of PG-ish film in some ways. So I got that. I was just very entertained by it. And you definitely it felt like it could have fit in the canon of a Jones movie.
Yeah. No, and I definitely feel that way. I definitely agree with you on that. I didn't grow up with the Universal monster movies, but I will say that I've since watched them, and it's funny because of the fact that I've watched the original Boris Karloff Mummy as well as the Hammer version of the story with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing.
Yeah.
And it's like every version of the story is essentially the same story.
Yeah.
And I do definitely prefer the stripped down horror version of the story to the adventure movie. I definitely see why people enjoyed the movie as far as popcorn entertainment and stuff like that. And to a certain extent, it does work relatively well in that respect. I'm personally not a big fan of it, but part of that is I really wasn't even a big fan of it then. I thought it was too silly. I thought it was too over the top. Watching it last week, the CGI is not aged well for this movie at all. I was really kind of shocked by that. And it was funny because of the fact that I'm going through some of my old review materials and stuff like that, and I came across one of my original mailing list emails that I sent to people, where I was basically talking about like my brief impressions of the movies of this summer that I had seen. And one of the things I had said about The Mummy, even though I didn't really like it, is that it had really great visual effects. I really don't know why I thought that. I mean, I guess maybe in 1999 I thought it was much more impressive. Maybe it was because it was on the big screen. But yeah, the effects in this movie really don't hold up at all.
I mean, so we've come. I mean, even I think the sequel came out 2 years later, and that has some a couple of effect shots, especially with The Rock, that are like a little rushed and don't hold up. But I think it's interesting that film came out like just before The Phantom Menace in '99.
Yeah,
And you think about these two films, and Mummy has some special effects where they were really trying some pretty breakthrough stuff for that time, and the amount of FX shots and moving and action, real actors. So it's always curious to me too. I know ILM did the effects. Was there possibly some, because of how many effects houses there were back then and artists, some competition, even though Lucas was doing a lot of stuff in house, did that kind of monopolize a lot of the VFX stuff at the time while the Mummy had, to do with whatever they could get?
yeah, I would imagine that was probably the case because, yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, I mean, this basically came out like 2 weeks before Phantom Menace.
Yeah.
And I will give them credit for, I will give them credit for this. Like, I think Sommers, who overall was not really a terribly good director, writer, director, I think he definitely has his issues, but I mean, are also movies of his that I have enjoyed to a certain extent as well. Um, he is trying. I think if you're going to adapt like that story of the Mummy to a big budget landscape, I think this is on the right mark. I mean, I still haven't seen the Tom Cruise Mummy from a couple of years ago, but just
Uh,
everything I've heard about it and seen about it, like it just there, it just is not really an effective retelling of that at all.
no, I mean, regrettably, I've actually seen that because I was like, oh, again, I like Universal Monsters, and I was intrigued because for me, again, what made this film was surprised me and what I thought I would originally hate coming from the source material and how many ways you can tell the story. Them opening it up and making it a big kind of action adventure epic where the Mummy comes in even later and it's more about the characters and like this quest. I thought that was an interesting way to open it up. So the Tom Cruise one, I was curious because I liked one of the writers on it and the idea that he is the Mummy this time, and even though there's another villain who is also some kind of mummy, I was like, okay, so they're updating it, but they're tweaking it in a way that the same way that I didn't think the first time the '99 one would work for me. Let me see how this works, and it did not work at all for many reasons. For many reasons. But I mean, it's interesting because I think Sommers is not a great filmmaker. He does have this one skill because I also realized after I'd seen The Mummy that he was somebody who I'd seen Deep Rising, which is not a good film at all. But I remember when I saw it late at night in some theater at the time, I was still thoroughly entertained. And I think one of his skills, or at least I haven't seen it as much in anything he's done since the original Mummy, and this is he's able to get a cast, and he uses a lot of similar cast members sometimes that is kind of on board for his craziness and tone, and that really elevate everything. Like I do not think the Mummy would work without the cast that it has and how much they actually add to it.
No, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, especially if you're going like one of my biggest issues with the movie is that I'm not really a fan of this. I'm not a particular fan of the comedic tone that this movie has, and it's an issue I have with other movies as well. I feel like Roland Emmerich's Godzilla's sort of did the same type of jokey
Yeah.
You know, the same type of humor. Michael Bay, a lot of Michael Bay's films revel in this type of humor. So I mean, it's not specific to Summers, but I mean, it's just this tone of comedy going into big action blockbusters that sort of came about at this time. And it's one of those things where it's like it just for the most part just rubs me the wrong way. Like I think the humor there's a lot of ridiculous humor in Independence Day, but for me that works because of the way that the actors and in particular Will Smith and Jeff Goldblum deliver it and sort of make you feel why that would be funny
Yeah.
in that particular moment. Here you have Brendan Fraser who he's not Harrison Ford in the type of thing he's going to give you in this type of role. But at the same time, I think for the way that Summers writes the character, he's a good fit. And it's because of the fact that he fits well with comedy. And he does fit well with goofy humor. Now, granted, I'm not a huge fan of that in most of this movie. I think the tone uh, just really takes away from any dramatic heft that this movie should have as an adventure movie.
Yeah.
But if you're going to go that route, Brendan Fraser's a good choice because of the fact that he can honestly sell a joke.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think every member of the cast, big and small, for me, actually shined very, very well. From like Arnold Vosloo as the Mummy to Rachel Weisz, sort of doing something she probably hadn't had much experience at the time doing as a serious dramatic actress, which is kind of like quirky. His girl Fry. I mean, I think that's what's funny is that like because it's set in the same period that the Indiana Jones films are in, and plays by some of those same like throwback kind of like epic war that kind of energy. I don't know that tone worked for me, and it's funny because not to say in any way that this film executes in any similar way than any of the Indiana Jones films. It's probably still better than the Kingdom of the Crystal Skulls. So I can fairly say that it's no Raiders. It's not even close to Raiders, but it's definitely better than Crystal Skulls. I think that even the Indiana Jones films have these moments of like there's levity, but it's like there's some ridiculous like action set piece silliness, like the never ending minecart roller coaster thing
In Temple
with
of Doom, yeah.
yeah, or which is a film about child slavery and human sacrifice.
Yeah.
So it jumps around, or like Sean Connery on a beach, taking down a Nazi plane by like chirping birds at it. I mean, these are silly moments. I think they're handled very well, and they give the audience a chance to relax.
Mm-hmm.
I think in The Mummy, they for the most part, there's probably definitely a few that don't hit the mark, or at least don't hit the mark anymore. They worked for me, but I would definitely say that like in further sequels of The Mummy, which I've seen, I mean, many things were blown up much bigger and louder and noisier, and not was well done. I think that humor is more consistent, where I would agree with you that it just doesn't work the same way.
Yeah. I mean, and I think I've seen the third one. I know I saw Mummy Returns, and I thought that was okay. I thought for some reason I thought Mummy Returns was I enjoyed it more. I felt like it hit the bounce better when I first saw it in 2001 than the original movie did. But I will say it's like as far as the cast. Now, granted, I'm not necessarily a fan of John Hannah's character in this movie. I think he's a little he's a little too goofy in this. There's not really a lot of serious parts, or I mean, and not that there has to be serious, but at least you have to have a little bit of I think you have to have a certain amount of way to ground each of these characters. I mean, I think you get with Brendan Fraser. I think you get to a certain extent with Rachel Weisz. And I really did enjoy her in this movie. This was like the first time I had really noticed her, and her and Fraser have real chemistry in this movie, and that's one of the reasons why I can sort of like look past some of the ways the characters are written, because of the fact that pull you into they really do pull you into this story that they go on together. Yeah, John Hannah as her brother. It's like I'm not the biggest fan of that performance, but I do like John Hannah because he's done really good work over the years.
Yeah, I think one of the issues, and maybe that's why it grates on you too, and that in visiting it again and looking at it, and as much as I love the cast, I think the kind of character that Hannah is playing is also there's many flip sides of that sort of like humorous, devious, scoundrelous kind of like he's clearly the good one, and then you've got Benny, who's like Brendan Fraser's cowardly, you know what I mean? Like who's like constantly backtracking, and it's I mean like again like you watch it and he's like I mean he's so committed in that role that I think is he feel like I remember watching the movie and being like in the same way I think he was the same actor in Deep Rising that like it steals scenes in movies. He's a fantastic actor.
Mm-hmm.
But there's and then there's also the very silly kind of, Sala-esque, Baron guy that is on the quest too. That has like a lot of like the slovenly, guy's going to get killed right away kind of thing. But they're the same facets of the same like jokey character with malicious intent sometimes that there might be just too many of them in the film for it to gel as well.
Yeah. And yeah, you mentioned Kevin J. O'Connor, who is fantastic actor, and he's done great work. It's like, yeah, it's you kind of watch his performance in this movie, and it's like my jaw just drops by like how he's performing this character. But I mean, it is kind of enjoyable, like to see him because he like you said, he's very committed to what he's doing in the movie.
Yeah, I mean, he straight up. I think the scenes he's in, he almost kind of steals because he's a very weirdly soulful actor who kind of plays these clowns a lot, and but like and that almost kind of grounds it in a reality that there's something going on. You know what I mean? This person actually exists, kind of thing.
Yeah, and you mentioned Arnold Vosloo, who plays Imhotep in the movie, and he really when there are a lot of times where when Imhotep is sort of like mid transition to being his full physical presence again, the CGI really is bad.
Yeah.
But Vosloo really helps sell that, and he's got a presence to him that is just fantastic. And I mean, it's that way with him whenever you see him. But I mean, in this movie in particular, he really does. He really is effective in that role.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like you can in many ways could be like, I mean, it worked out for him because he came back for the sequel in a little bit more bigger way. But like, I think it's almost like a thankless role, except I think, especially in the very beginning of the film, before he's mummified and before the story starts, he just even in that short, prologue, he sort of sets up that presence you're talking about and who that character is, and in his expressions, the passion and the anger and the betrayal and all that stuff, so that later on, when you are watching CGI that may or may not be the best it can be or hold up, or that you're not seeing the full him being able to express it, you kind of have this weird seared in memory of who that person was and why this is all happening. That I think he was smart enough or talented enough to kind of ground it there, so that it can come back in a way that you don't get to see but you feel.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned the opening scenes, and yeah, I mean his presence in those scenes is really great as far as setting up the story. I mean, unfortunately, they felt the need to add narration to this for some reason, and as opposed to just showing us. I mean, I guess I get it to a certain extent, but at the same time, it really just it doesn't feel necessary. Like you're showing us these actions that you're telling us about, so just show us. And I think that would made it even more impressive. Although, I mean, I did feel like watching it last week that the opening scene looks very artificial. I mean, again, that goes to the fact that the visual effects that are employed here are not really, they don't really hold up well.
Right.
But just the way that it sets up that the story of the mummy is really something that I like. I just am like, why are you? It's very few times is narration a good thing in a movie. I mean, very
Yeah.
few movies can use it really really well. But yeah, this one doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I wondered, like, at the end of the day, especially for that time period, it was a big tent film from Universal that they were going to force some exposition one way or another because they weren't going to be like, let's show this opening with no narration and people will sit and get it. That's not going to happen for the audience they were probably hunting for. At the same time, I don't know, as a filmmaker, and knowing the constraints and probably what the studio wants and what they're expecting, I don't know if it would have felt any better had we not had that kind of cold opening,
right?
And then told the story, or if we kind of had, through the discovery of the characters, that exposition and background. Because again, I think in some way, if nothing else, the narration certainly hurts it in some way. But I think setting up Buslu, who we're not really going to see in totality until like the very end, and what how important that person was and what he did for her and what that sentenced them to, I think probably is necessary to come first. I mean, but like when you actually have somebody kind of like telling a legendary story in quick cuts of all this stuff, it definitely feels like Exposition City.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and yeah, I'm not sure if I would get rid of the narration completely, but I would just minimize it. Set the stage a little bit. It's like, this is where we are, and this is sort of how, or at least make it on the back end, or just don't. It feel there's just too much of it.
No, I mean,
big issue.
I think the narrator even says there's a great visual where the the even the priest, but the female is painted, the emperor's the pharaoh's bride or whatever, and that it's also it's a decorative thing, but it's also because no one can touch her but him. Yeah. And if anyone touches her, they'll notice it, which is a great visual that makes sense without, like, you know what I mean? Like, because he literally says, like, who touched you when you see the smudge? You didn't need someone setting up that he doesn't want anyone to touch her, Like, it's there. So, yeah, there's definitely moments where at least could have been peeled away a bit. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the music here. It's by the great Jerry Goldsmith, and I'm of mixed feeling with this because on the one hand, I feel like the music, I feel like Goldsmith is really working overtime to sell this movie. Maybe where some of the dramatic limitations exist in Sommers' filmmaking, but at the same time, it still very much has a very entertaining feel to it as far as the score. And it's just really it's well calibrated for the type of movie it is. So it's kind of hard to fault Goldsmith too much. I mean, he was a fantastic composer. I mean, it's a shame we lost him what he did, but at the same time, I think the way he was able to do something on a more adventure scale while also having some terror there, the way he's able to hit all of the bases that the movie is trying to hit, and for me not completely succeeding, I'm a mixed feeling with this Goldsmith score, but overall I can't really fault it too much.
I mean, I think Goldsmith is a professional and it does what it's supposed to do. I think its main flaw is that probably that, even though the action scenes, I think it fits quite well and aids it in a way. I think that overall it's flat in a way that, like, he's not being lazy, but I would use the word lazy in so much as, like, just even some of the, like, not the non-action shots, but the epic sprawling when they're going through the desert or the quest. that sort of like faux Egyptian kind of like sitar. It always just feels like a play on, you know, Lawrence of Arabia or something. Like every time we're in a desert, we have to hear like a mix of this, like it's almost like a Muzak CD of like Arabian Nights you would find. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing to it. It's just like, oh yeah, they're coming over a dune in a wide shot, so let's have that. You know, sun is hot, kind of thing. There's nothing that like to me stood out, which I mean that there's nothing that like stuck out in a negative way to me. It just sort of felt like it's there. Didn't, you know.
I will say I do think the second half of this movie really it feels like it is on a little bit better footing. As far as being a big adventure, as far as being a big sort of monster movie, I think the way the story progresses and the way it and the way it unfolds for the most part is actually pretty decent. I still think, you know, again, the visual effects don't hold up, but I mean, I think the overall ideas of how they get where they're going makes sense, and really, I I I enjoyed the second half of the movie more than I think I enjoyed the first half.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I really appreciate all the actors, so I appreciate the pace of it, and that it wasn't rushed to get to the thing, and that you're developing all these different stories. There's a lot of characters. It does have that sort of Dean Devlin kind of like ensemble thing going on, and they're all kind of like connecting to what eventually becomes the quest, and then the denouement in the third act. But I think one of the things that hurts the first act is that even though you're talking about a mummy and there's some little bit of violence and craziness in the very beginning and that cold opening that's marred by the narration, there doesn't seem to be a lot of stakes. Like even when Brendan Fraser like being about to be hung and she has to save him and like whatever, you don't feel there's no danger. But then I mean you get to that temple and bodies are dropping in horrific ways, and you know a mummy is going to come back to life by eating the people who have like gotten this curse by touching his gold, which is great. You know, it's like for that to suddenly be that, it is kind of nuts. And then that, of course, sets off everything else that happens towards the end. So I think it just picks up when like it looks like things can actually happen and affect the world in bad ways.
Mm-hmm. I've only seen the original, because this is in the old Universal monster movies. This is a franchise in the same way like Dracula and Frankenstein and the rest of the monsters were franchises, right? Like this had sequels.
It did. It never quite caught on as much because I think and I think that's one of the things about the Mummy, and that's why I was interested in like some of the versions that were possibly going to be made, and was so confused when I saw that first trailer for this one, because the Mummy is kind of like the Aquaman of the Universal. Where like he's a tragic character. It is about. I mean, there's only so much you can do with the mummy. It's essentially a skeletal corpse wrapped in rags. You know what I mean? Like what's it gonna do by making him sort of like by weaving in the occult, and then they also put in that like romantic lost love thing like Dracula. They give him some more oomph, but even that, it just doesn't. It never feels concerning as scary as like a Wolfman or a monstrous Frankenstein or like a vindictive vampire. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have that same thing. And I think that by making it more of an action epic and like the curse and that, they were able to kind of get around what would have been like a really weird, you know, that kind of thing. It just doesn't have the stakes. And the same thing with Aquaman. It's sort of like it's a very like medieval kind of almost Shakespearean character, but it's like a dude who's under the sea who swims and talks to fish. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't have the gusto that you could do with other stuff.
Okay, I was just kind of curious about that, and yeah, you are right because of the fact that if you once that story is so self-contained, like in the old movies, and whether you're talking about the Universal one, whether you're talking about the Hammer one, it's fundamentally the same story, and it's so. There's not real like you said, there's not really much room for it to grow, and so I mean I will give I will give this franchise that, where it's like they at least tried to do something a bit different with this material to make it a franchise. I mean, I'm somebody who doesn't necessarily, every successful movie doesn't need to be a franchise, but and I think some really damn good movies have sort of been marred by the fact that they were turned into franchises. But at the same time, I mean, I think this was a solid attempt. I mean, especially when you got to the Mummy Returns and add the Scorpion King, and then you had that spin-off, and then you just having different, the fact that they were able to come up with like different stories, and regardless of how they are on artistic merits, you could at least say that there's something there for this type of movie to be able to exist as a big genre movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that in a weird way, the character being so closed off gave it an avenue for them to kind of make it this movie, which, like I said, when I first saw, I was like, how the hell do you do that? And that looks like that's going to be terrible. And it worked because they were able to adapt that character into something else. Whereas you take, then I think Summer eventually went on to do Van Helsing and do all the monsters in the same kind of vein.
Yeah.
And it was an absolute night, many, many, many awful things we could talk about that. But but it also doesn't work for those characters because there is no opening for that. They have a more specific, they have many different realms you can play with, and there's like sequels, and they can all meet each other. Even Universal did that, but it's not an epic with Frankenstein. It's not an epic with Dracula like that. So I think they were smartly able to do it with the Mummy.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is because yes, he did do Van Helsing, and it's like that idea of the Universal Monster franchise was almost you could almost say it's the horror equivalent of Marvel right now.
Yeah, it was the original. Absolutely.
But at the same time, like with what happened with Van Helsing, you can't really connect those characters in a way that really makes a whole lot of sense and really will do justice to all of those characters. I have mixed feelings on Van Helsing. Overall, I kind of enjoyed it, but there were things about that I just was not a fan of. It's probably my least favorite interpretation of Dracula I've ever seen in a movie.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, it's, you have these great, and I mean, if you haven't gotten any of the Universal box sets with the monster movies, I highly recommend it. I mean, I will say the one thing I loved about Van Helsing is that it gave us those legacy collections where it not only had the original movies in those franchises, but all the sequels. And going through those sequels was fascinating to see sort of like how basically those stories progressed and how people tried to make franchises out of those characters.
Absolutely. I mean, it really was the first. Even before the comic books were a thing, it was a shared universe where you would have like the Mummy, the Frankenstein would meet the Wolfman, and eventually they'd all convene in Dracula's castle. And the thing about them is they would progress in a linear storyline where things, like, for the most part, mostly sunk up. But some of them were. The worst of them were kind of just cheap, like, they just happen to cross paths and there's a fight, but it's mostly a lot of killing time just to sell tickets. And then there are some that actually have, like, House of Frankenstein, I think, is brilliant. I have the Blu-ray of the Universals, and I was watching it again, and it connects all these different, like, subplots and characters and gives weight. It honors all the different characters. And I think what's happening now, whether it's the failed attempt at the universe of Marvel monsters that they were trying to do with the Cruise film and other stuff, or even Van Helsing, I think they're not honoring who these characters are and their history. They're trying to create an Avengers, but they don't have the licenses to superhero characters. So they're like, well, I mean, these things all have powers and they're all mutants, so let's put them together to do what? I mean, like what's the point? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I'd much rather, and yeah, I mean, the whole idea of the dark universe was silly for a lot of reasons. And I mean, it was in Van Helsing. There's a reason most people don't really think about Van Helsing much anymore. But I like the idea of, I don't mind the idea of this generation's filmmakers updating those monsters, like, and bringing their own sensibilities to those stories. What's the what's I can't pronounce his name, but he was the writer on Saw, and he directed Upgrade last year.
Which which one did he direct?
Upgrade, but he was also the writer of
I think,
Saw too.
yeah. Was it Lee? Is it Lee Wennell?
Yeah, yeah. He's doing The Invisible Man for Bloomhouse, and it's like, I
Yeah.
think that idea of doing doing revisiting these characters on lower budget and just retelling these stories and giving filmmakers a way to retell these stories in a way that interests them is really the best way to go, as opposed to saying, oh, these are all going to be part of the same universe, they're all going to team up and stuff like that. I mean, it's another showing of Hollywood just having no I of wanting to, don't just copy Marvel. It's like, do your own thing within what Marvel is doing. Fine,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
do a shared universe, but do it in your own way.
Yeah. I mean, if it, like, and also just first tell some good stories and establish these characters where they also mean something to a world that, like, listen, like, I love Universal monsters. I don't know. I think one of the, also the, sadly, the failings is that you can go back and revisit those films if you've never seen them, or if you've seen them when you were a kid, and appreciate them and love them. But I don't think that those characters in today's world, today's film, today's pop culture, outside of a niche audience, have the same effect and pull. I don't think, you can have nostalgia for some of the 80s slashers, but even that, I don't know, has that much pull. I don't know. They're making another Space Jam. I don't even know how much the Looney Tunes characters mean to people anymore today, outside of, like, oh, I remember that when I was you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can appreciate it and love it, but I think if you're trying to, like, I don't know if there's a hunger or a desire for it, but I do think that you can take interesting filmmakers doing unique spins on the characters. Like, even The Invisible Man. I remember seeing Verhoeven's The Hollow Man, which explored that kind of, basically it's an Invisible Man story, but it explores essentially the same themes in an updated way that's so good and powerful that I think you could get filmmakers today to do those updates that are about those characters and what they actually mean in an updated world, but not also trying to just cram them together in some weird team up action adventure thing, know?
I mean, you think of Shape of Water. I mean, that's essentially Del Toro doing his Creature of the Black Lagoon.
Sure.
And I mean, putting his own spin on it. And I mean, it's one of those, I mean, yeah, and I would love to see, I don't know who would direct a modern take of Dracula, but I mean, I do feel like you could do I think that would be, I think in the hands of the right filmmaker, you could make an amazing new adaptation of that story.
Yeah, I mean, I think the trick is, now Dracula is a curious case because you kind of, I don't know what room, aside from the plethora of different kinds of vampire stories, I don't know how you've done the straight adaptations of Bram Stoker's material a couple of times. You've done the Lugosi, you've done his origin story, I think that came out a few years ago. There's so many different, you've done bringing him into the present. The Hammers did that at a certain point. Mm-hmm. I don't know what room there is, say, for a Dracula, but I think the same way that, like, Marvel has had success with characters that weren't necessarily Spider-Man or that were so well known. Like, who'd have thought that Thor would be such an important, you know what I mean? Like, who didn't know about this, or that all, like, the Guardians of the Galaxy. I think a smart thing is that Universal has a host of, like, films and characters and monsters that haven't been done to death, that if they went and started with those, mm-hmm. I think that would that would even be easier not only to adapt into modern day, but also if they were going to do some kind of shared universe, you could get away with it more because you don't have such an iconic established thing that it almost feels like the pieces shouldn't fit anymore.
Yeah.
So I mean that would be my, if anyone's listening to this that has any connections at Universal, that's what you do. But or that's what I said to do. But no, I mean I think that's just it. I think that it's about you would definitely get somebody like Guillermo del Toro who loves and appreciates monsters and that history. You need to find filmmakers that also know. They want to put their own spin on it, but also know who these characters are. And I don't know how much Somerville knew about the Mummy or cared about the character as a universal thing, but in reading about all the different iterations that didn't happen, the Clive Barker one, they in their own uniqueness, I think, were so far off the mark. And Sommer took it and said, "No, I'm gonna make an action adventure movie, but I'm gonna appreciate this character and organically fit it in as much as I can by expanding it." And he just got, I don't know if he did skill or luck, but or cast.
And I will say, I mean, and bringing it back to Sommers' film, I mean, I will say that was probably the smartest way to do a modern update of the Mummy at that time. I mean, you're talking about Clive Barker, the idea of him doing a Mummy. It's like I'd be fascinated by that because of the fact that I do like Clive Barker and I'm interested in what he has to say as a horror filmmaker, but at the same time, I can completely understand him just not really sort of getting it and not really being the type of filmmaker who would be able to tell this. He wouldn't necessarily be the best fit for this story. And yeah, Sommers maybe wasn't either, but at least I will say at least he had an idea to bring this movie to bring this story into a modern cinemax setting of like the Indiana Jones type adventure. And even if I don't think it's a successful film overall, I mean it's obviously one that connected with audiences because it was a big hit and it launched its own franchise.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I watch it and I think, and I would love to know if this was at all his things. I think actually when I was reading about it, I think he actually did pitch it this way, which originally goes back to the tweet that you were angry about. Is that this is kind of his version of Raiders of the Lost Ark in so much. I think he was very interested in doing a kind of Indiana Jones-esque film that was about adventure with a supernatural tinge artifact and, comedy and also a period setting, which I think one of the things I appreciate is the fact that the period setting and its limitations, you know what I mean, of that time period and doing stuff like even the plane, and like how they get from place to place on boat. And
yeah,
it just gives it a different feel than like, even when you've never seen it, but like the Tom Cruise Mummy, the modernness of it also just feels so out of whack with like, why in a world of like nuclear weapons and SWAT teams and stuff like this, why is this, like what is going on? Like, like it just doesn't make sense. Yeah. So yeah, I appreciate the time period setting.
No, I do as well. I mean, it was the right way to approach it. I mean, no, I don't think that it's like I would say if you were to tell me that you enjoy this more than Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, it's like that's completely fair. Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is a deeply flawed Indiana Jones movie, for a lot of reasons. Although I disagree with some of those reasons with some people, but ultimately I completely understand why people aren't a fan of it. But yeah, the fact that this is set in that time period, you don't update it, because that turns it into a different movie and not necessarily a good movie. So
yeah. I mean, I think I guess, and there's also probably a part of me that has that weird attachment to it because I remember always wanting to see one more Indiana Jones film, which after which after Crystal Skulls and hopefully whatever comes next is one of those cases of like, be careful what you wish for because you might get it. but I remember that, that this felt like I got a taste of that feeling that what I liked about that series that somebody, and nowhere near as well, but like that I felt like that it felt enjoyable to me in a way that I was so unexpected because I truly went into this film not expecting to like it and also not knowing what the hell I was supposed to be getting and was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm. Well, David, thank you for joining me today to discuss The Mummy.
Wow. It was my pleasure.
Yeah. And we'll be talking a little bit later in the year about another 1999 movie with a horror bent on Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow, and I'm definitely looking forward to that conversation with you.
Yeah, that's a yeah.
But yeah, thank you very much for joining me today.
No problem, man. Anytime.
I'd like to thank David Spaltro for joining me today to discuss Stephen Sommers' The Mummy. Like we teased, we've got one more with him for 1999. It's going to be on Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow, and I'm really looking forward to that discussion. It's going to be a good companion piece to this one in particular, in the way it looks at old genre films and updates them. That's it for me for the Sonic Cinema podcast. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Thank you for subscribing at the Sonic Cinema podcast YouTube channel. Hit me up at www.patreon.com/SonicCinema. I actually just updated the reward tiers, so that's something that would be good to check out, and every little bit helps there. For now, this is Brian Scuttle, and thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com.